Back when MiHoYo announced Dehya will be added to the standard banner, two realizations came to my mind. 1. They definitely undertuned her kit on purpose to make her fate on a more accessible banner, and 2. Her strong constellations will be easier to obtain. While it was clear right off the bat that Dehya was a weak character, it was also always clear that her constellations were great, to the point I thought it was pretty scummy to lock a huge power boost for a mediocre character behind a paywall. While Dehya being in the standard banner doesn't excuse this, I believe that every standard character should have great constellations, as they're generally 5 stars that you could end up pulling several times. Without further ado, let's start with the analysis. First of all, I've been able to use a constellation to Dehya with her signature weapon, so up to that investment level I will be able to back my analysis up with playtesting, while for higher investment levels I will mostly rely on theory crafting. I've also tested Dehya at Constellation 0, so I can easily highlight the differences between the two versions. The performance in this video will be evaluated based on what I believe to be the best DPS Dehya team, namely Mono Pyro with Xianling, Bennett and Kazuha. At Constellation 0, I think this team is mostly carried by Bennett and Kazuha's presence, who really magnify the damage and the AoE output of the composition. Let's see if anything changes with Dehya's constellations. Based on my calculations and understanding, basically all of Dehya's constellations are great, excluding her talent level ones, which are generally not incredible for any character. Constellation 1 is probably the one you've heard about the most, as it's notorious for increasing her HP scaling multipliers by a big amount. With Bennett on the team, and on a Mono Pyro team, which is worth mentioning as in this context Dehya has huge attack buffs that don't benefit the HP scaling, the Constellation 1 still ends up being a damage increase of 28% for her. To explain how unusual this is, Constellation 1s generally range between 0 and 10% in terms of damage increase, with things like Hutao's Constellation 1 being outliers. In Dehya's case, excluding her Constellation 6, her Constellation 1 is the biggest pulling related increase she can get. Her signature weapon, the Beacon of the Red Sea, is also a relevant increase depending on what other weapons you have. Compared to strong ones such as Redhorn, Wolf's Gravestone, and even a Refinement 5 Akumaru, it's around a 10% damage increase. Compared to weaker 4-star weapons, it's around a 20% damage increase, which is definitely big for a character in a damage dealing role. To put it in perspective, a Constellation 1 Dehya with her signature is 50% stronger in terms of damage compared to a Constellation 0 Dehya with Serpent Spine, which is enormous. Still, these numbers need to be contextualized. In fact, at that constellation level, and at decent artifact investment levels, on a Mono Pyro team, Dehya still ends up dealing less damage than a typical on-field carry throughout a single rotation, as her damage is around 450,000, which is a DPS of 22,000. In my opinion, the baseline to be a good DPS on a team that provides as many buffs as Dehya is getting on Mono Pyro is around 30,000 DPS, which is what characters like Klee can reach on Mono Pyro, or Itto can easily surpass on Mono Geo. Even though Dehya has a much shorter damage window than those characters, Mono Pyro doesn't really benefit from that aspect as a team, since it can't do much in terms of on-field damage with that spared field time, so it's sort of a wasted advantage. Her Constellation 2 gives a 50% damage buff to her elemental skill whenever the active character gets hit in between the skill procs, and it also increases the skill duration by 6 seconds. This is both a decent damage increase, as the intervals between skill hits are long enough that you'll probably get hit semi-consistently in that time frame, and a nice utility buff, as it makes her skill uptime much better, meaning it's good for off-field Dehya teams. Still, the full interruption resistance effect she provides through her passive, which I believe to be the best part of her defensive utility, doesn't get extended, which is a shame. Since this is the constellation level I tested her at, I can speak from experience and say that a difference can definitely be felt. At this point, Dehya's damage per rotation is around 500,000 and the team DPS around 53,000, which generally can be seen as average or above average depending on the utility level the team has at its disposal. Personally, I think that at this point, this mono Pyro variant is pretty good, as it can also benefit from things such as Kazuha's grouping utility and the combined defensive effects of Bennett and Dehya, which practically make you immortal. In a way, it feels similar to playing a mono Geo Ito team, but with a grouping effect on top, and better AoE in general thanks to Kazuha. I genuinely had fun using Dehya at this point, while I was definitely frustrated with her Constellation 0 performance, as it usually took me 1 or 2 more rotations to clear stuff, which can be pretty annoying if your team is also starving for energy, as prolonged energy management in those cases can be tricky. The next breakpoint for Dehya is her Constellation 4, which gives her a considerable energy refund on burst, and an extra healing effect which, to be honest, isn't really needed on Mono Pyro. With the energy refund in mind, on a Mono Pyro team, she can be used with around 115% energy recharge, as opposed to 160% at lower constellations. While this is great, it doesn't really change her team playstyle by much, as she is still tied to Bennett in terms of particle generations, since her home generation is pretty awful. Basically, you will still have issues unless you keep using Bennett's skill at least a couple times per rotation. Still, Constellation 4 is a damage increase, as it allows you to remove some energy recharge substats, which is beneficial even if you use the Emblem of Severed Fate set. In the best case scenario, namely when you can turn all of your energy recharge substats into crate substats, Dehya reaches around 600,000 damage per rotation, so close to 30,000 DPS on a team whose rotations are between 20 and 21 seconds long. This is the point where I would call Dehya a true main carry for the team. The final breakpoint is her Constellation 6, and that's where things become really interesting for her. This constellation provides her burst damage some crit related bonuses, and extends her burst window by a maximum of 2 seconds, which allows her to throw 5 additional punches. On average, I've estimated this to be over a 40% damage increase if compared to Constellation 5 for her, which allows her to reach around 900,000 damage per rotation and 40,000 DPS. Naturally, the team rotation gets extended to around 22 or 23 seconds, but despite that, Dehya's damage increase is meaningful enough that the extensions is totally worth it, as the Mono Pyro team reaches around 65,000 DPS. This is not extremely high as far as high investment characters go, as somebody like Klee with her Constellation 2 on the team can also allow it to reach similar damage amounts, but it's worth noting that Dehya's damage being compressed into a relatively small window opens up for very interesting speedrun possibilities in both single target and AoE. In general, at this constellation level, the team becomes strong enough that you should be able to clear every type of a base stage very easily. While this should be a given for Constellation 6 characters, you should also consider that most other standard characters have pretty bad constellations, making Dehya the only one you'd probably like to get multiple copies of, aside from Tignari. To answer the question this video revolves around, so whether or not Dehya can be saved by constellations, I would say her Constellation 1 makes her strong enough that you can enjoy her Mono Pyro variant without it feeling decisively weaker if compared to other alternatives. The Constellation 4 makes her very respectable in the role, and the Constellation 6 makes her very strong, although definitely weaker if compared to other Constellation 6 characters. Basically, if you end up getting Dehya in the standard banner, don't despair, as accumulating her constellations over time is something your account might benefit from.